Her parents had not simply given her away, they had sold her. A child, black and burdened by a mind that saw the world in a kaleidoscope of disjointed brilliance and crushing noise, deemed an unbearable weight. The whispers had started subtly, then escalated into a cacophony of judgment. Odd, slow, a burden on their good Christian name. In the brutal landscape of the Reconstruction South, where freedom was a fragile promise and prejudice a stubborn weed, her difference was a defect, her quiet resistance a defiance. Her small hands, prone to flapping when overwhelmed, had always seemed alien to them. Her deep-set eyes, which saw too much and too little, a mirror reflecting their own profound discomfort. This was not an act of desperation, but a calculated divestment, a shedding of what they perceived as a curse, disguised as a transaction. The heavy air in the cramped, dust-mote-filled room had seemed to press down on her, stealing the very breath from her lungs as the words, sharp and final, were exchanged. She had understood the essence, if not the lexicon, of their cruelty. Her name, Ilara, felt like a foreign sound in her own ears, belonging to a girl they no longer recognized, or perhaps had never truly seen. The world outside the window, a blur of sun-baked earth and distant shimmering heat, promised nothing but more of the same indifference, more of the same crushing solitude. Her small body trembled, not with cold, but with an internal chill that seeped into her bones, a premonition of the vast, empty space that was about to swallow her whole. The faint scent of stale tobacco and the acrid tang of fear hung heavy, a shroud over the transaction, over the abandonment. She was a commodity, a problem to be solved, traded for a meager sum that spoke volumes of her perceived worth, a damning indictment of a society that could so easily discard its most vulnerable. The shadow of an unseen man, a freedman, they said, loomed large in her nascent understanding, an unknown future replacing a known suffocating past. What new terrors awaited a child who could not conform, could not simply be in a world that demanded conformity, a world that measured worth in compliance? This was the beginning of her true journey, not towards freedom, but into an uncharted wilderness of existence. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The exchange had been brief, brutal in its efficiency. Ilara, then barely 6 years old, stood by the peeling wallpaper, her thin frame rigid, a porcelain doll about to be discarded. Her mother, Sarah, a woman whose face was etched with a lifetime of hard labor and harder judgments, had averted her eyes, unable or unwilling to meet the silent accusation in Ilara's gaze. Her father, Thomas, a man whose hands were rough from the plow and whose heart seemed equally unyielding, spoke in clipped tones, his words like stones dropped into a shallow well. "She ain't right, mister. Never has been. Can't talk proper," screams at the son. "We tried, Lord knows we tried." His voice lacked conviction, instead carrying the tired resignation of a man who had made his peace with an uncomfortable truth. Ilara understood not right to mean not like others, a phrase that had haunted her every waking moment, every desperate attempt to connect. The man, a freedman named Silas, had simply nodded, his eyes dark and fathomless resting on Ilara with an unnerving stillness. He hadn't asked questions, hadn't bartered, merely counted out the agreed-upon coin, a paltry sum that underscored Ilara's perceived worthlessness. The glint of silver in his palm was a stark, material representation of her parents' abandonment, a currency of betrayal. She could feel the vibrations of her mother's silent sobs, a tremor that ran through the floorboards, but offered no comfort, no reprieve. The air throbbed with unarticulated grievances, with the weight of years of strained silence and frustrated expectations. Ilara, sensing the finality, felt a peculiar detachment, as if her small spirit had already begun to untether itself from the corporeal confines of her body. Her mind, a whirlwind of fragmented images and unfiltered sensations, struggled to process the gravity of the moment, yet the core truth settled deep within her. She was being cast out. The memory of her father's frustrated sighs, her mother's withdrawn embraces coalesced into a single, painful understanding. This wasn't a choice for her, but a destiny imposed, a life sentence passed down by those who should have offered solace. The raw, guttural fear that had been building inside her finally manifested as a soft, whimpering sound, barely audible over the rustle of the coins, yet it was the only protest she could muster, a fragile cry against an unyielding world. Her small, calloused fingers, usually busy tracing patterns on the floor, now curled into tight, desperate fists, clinging to nothing but the emptiness that now surrounded her. The journey with Silas was a blur of dust and silence. Alara sat beside him in the rickety wagon, her small body jostling with every rut in the unpaved road. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the earth into a hard, cracked shell, mirroring the desiccation she felt within. Silas said little, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his silhouette stark against the vast, indifferent sky. He was a man of few words, his presence a heavy, undeniable weight. His silence, unlike her parents' accusatory quietude, felt different. Not judgmental, but observant, almost a void into which she could pour her own unspoken fears without judgment. Still, apprehension gnawed at her. She had known abandonment, but never a journey towards an unknown destination with a stranger. Every creak of the wagon wheel, every rustle of the dry leaves in the sparse trees, seemed amplified in her sensitive ears, assaulting her fragile composure. She clutched a small, crudely carved wooden bird, her only possession, a silent anchor in the turbulent sea of her anxiety. The bird, with its chipped wings and faded paint, felt smooth and comforting beneath her thumb, a tangible link to a past she was rapidly losing. The landscape changed slowly, from sun-baked fields to a sparse, almost desolate stretch of scrubland, then to a cluster of distant, humble dwellings. Each turn of the wheel felt like another thread unraveling from the fabric of her life, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She stole glances at Silas, trying to decipher the enigma of his face, the lines etched around his eyes that spoke of untold stories and burdens. His hands, gripping the reins, were large and calloused, strong hands that had known labor, hands that offered no immediate comfort, but seemed to possess a quiet strength. The air itself felt different here, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and something else, something wild and untamed, like the distant rumble of thunder before a storm. Her stomach churned with a mixture of fear and a faint, almost imperceptible curiosity. What kind of home awaited her? What kind of man was this Silas who had bought her as if she were a field animal, yet offered no cruelty, only this vast, unsettling quiet? The anticipation was a tight knot in her chest, a constant low thrum of dread mingling with a desperate, unspoken hope for a different kind of existence, a life where her very being wasn't a source of such profound disappointment. Silas's home was a small, weather-beaten cabin, nestled amongst a cluster of towering, ancient oaks. It was humble, yet felt more lived in, more authentic than the neat, sterile house she had left behind. The air inside smelled of earth, old wood, and a faint, sweet scent she couldn't quite place, perhaps dried herbs. He moved with a deliberate slowness, his movements measured, his gaze always calm, never demanding. Alara, overwhelmed by the new sensory input, instinctively retreated into herself. She found a corner by the hearth, her back pressed against the cool, rough logs, and curled into a tight ball, her small wooden bird clutched to her chest. She refused the meager meal he offered, her stomach too knotted with fear, and the lingering scent of her abandonment to accept sustenance. Silas did not press her. He simply placed the plate of stew and cornbread within her reach, then sat across the room, quietly mending a torn piece of canvas. The rhythmic pull of his needle through the fabric was the only sound, a steady, comforting pulse in the vast silence. It was a silence that spoke of respect, of an understanding that went beyond words. She watched him from beneath lowered lashes, observing the way his strong fingers worked with such delicate precision, the concentration etched on his weathered face. He was not like the men she knew, who barked commands or offered exasperated sighs. He simply was a presence in the room that did not judge, did not demand. This lack of expectation was, in its own way, unsettling. She was accustomed to the constant pressure to conform, to speak, to be something she was not. His calm acceptance of her silence, her withdrawal, was a foreign concept, a soft blanket of quietude that slowly began to unspool the tight knot in her chest. Days bled into nights with the same quiet rhythm. He would work in his small garden, cultivating meager crops or mend his tools, always within her sight. Never too close, never too far. He left her be, but his presence was a constant, steady anchor. Slowly, tentatively, she began to explore the cabin, touching the rough wood of the walls, running her fingers over the smooth surface of a worn ceramic bowl. One afternoon, he left a small, smooth river stone on the floor near her, a dull gray lump. She picked it up, surprised by its weight, its coolness. It was nothing, yet it was a deliberate offering. It was the first small step, a silent invitation, and a quiet, profound understanding began to bridge the chasm between them. The memory, like a splinter lodged deep beneath the skin, resurfaced unbidden. Mama Sarah, her face contorted in a mask of exasperation, had often repeated the same refrain. "She's got the devil in her, I swear. Can't be reasoned with." These words, spoken in hushed tones to the gossiping women of the church, had been a prelude to their ultimate rejection. The women, with their pursed lips and knowing glances, would nod sagely, their eyes flicking towards Alara, who would be sitting by herself, meticulously arranging pebbles into patterns only she could discern. Their pity was a cruel, heavy thing, far worse than open disdain. It implied a deficiency, a lack that could not be remedied, a brokenness that made her unworthy. A black child with such afflictions, one had whispered, a double burden in God's eyes. The phrase had struck Alara then, a cold, sharp blade cutting deeply. She understood the weight of being black in a society built on white supremacy, but to be afflicted too, to be doubly damned by her very existence, felt an unbearable load. Her parents, desperate to escape the societal judgment, had seen her as a direct challenge to their respectability, a visible stain on their meager claim to normalcy. Thomas, her father, had often come home from the fields, his body weary, his spirit broken, and Alara's inability to conform, her peculiar ways, had been another burden too heavy for his shoulders. He would bark at her, demanding she act right, demanding she be normal, his voice cracking with a frustration that was born less of anger and more of despair. The community, primarily other black families struggling for their own footing in a hostile world, had offered no true solace. They were too busy battling their own demons of poverty and prejudice to embrace a child who required such specific, demanding care, a child who didn't fit neatly into the molds they were desperately trying to cast for their own survival. The church, usually a sanctuary, had become a source of profound discomfort, its hymns too loud, its sermons too abstract, its expectations too rigid. Alara would retreat behind the pews, finding solace only in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, or the intricate patterns of light and shadow on the worn wooden floor. Their decision to sell her, then, was not an isolated act of malice, but the culmination of years of societal pressure, of whispered judgments, of their own inability to cope with a child who defied all their preconceived notions of what a daughter should be. It was a surrender to the pervasive prejudices of the era, a tragic testament to how deeply ingrained the biases against difference, especially within the context of race and poverty, could become, twisting even the bonds of family into something unrecognizable, something transactional. The cabin, once a place of daunting silence, began to hum with a subtle, nurturing rhythm. Silas, a man of profound patience, rarely spoke, but his actions were a symphony of quiet understanding. He noticed the way the rough texture of wood sometimes caused Alara to recoil, and he began sanding the edges of the worn table, smoothing them with meticulous care. He observed her fascination with patterns, how she would spend hours arranging pebbles or sticks into intricate designs. One day, he brought home a collection of smooth, colorful river stones, presenting them to her without a word. Alara, startled by the unexpected gift, looked up. Her wide eyes, usually clouded with apprehension, now held a flicker of curiosity. She took the stones, turning them in her small palm, their cool, polished surfaces a balm to her sensitive touch. He never forced her to speak, never demanded eye contact, but instead communicated through shared moments of quiet observation. He would sit with her in the evening, watching the fireflies dance outside the window, their blinking lights a silent conversation. He discovered her aversion to loud noises, and began to move with an even greater softness, his footsteps barely disturbing the dust on the floorboards. Slowly, painstakingly, Alara began to emerge from her self-imposed shell. She would watch Silas as he worked, her gaze tracing the arc of his movements. One afternoon, while he was tending his small vegetable patch, she picked up a fallen feather, its soft down a gentle contrast to the harsh world outside. She carried it to him, holding it out, a silent offering. Silas paused, his calloused fingers gently taking the feather. He looked at her, and in his eyes, Alara saw not pity, not frustration, but a profound, quiet acceptance. It was a warmth that spread through her small body, thawing the perpetual chill she had carried since birth. This was not the chaotic, demanding love of her parents, nor the judgmental gaze of the community. This was something deeper, something that understood her unspoken language. He began to teach her, not with words, but with shared tasks. She learned to sort dried beans by color, to carry water from the well without spilling, to feel the texture of different fabrics. Each small victory, each new understanding, was a thread woven into the fabric of their growing bond. The cabin, which once felt like a temporary holding place, slowly began to transform into a sanctuary, a place where her differences were not just tolerated, but quietly, profoundly, understood. The fear within her, once a constant gnawing presence, began to recede, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of belonging, a feeling that perhaps, in this quiet, unassuming man, she had found an anchor in a tumultuous world. The fragile peace of the cabin was abruptly shattered by the arrival of a delegation from the town. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long, accusatory shadows across the dusty yard. Two men, their faces grim and unyielding, accompanied by a woman whose stern features Alara dimly recognized as a distant relative, stood before Silas's door. Their presence was a heavy, suffocating weight, a tangible manifestation of the world's enduring judgment. "Silas," one of the men, a self-appointed community elder, began, his voice laced with an air of self-righteous authority. "We've heard talk about the child you've taken in. Folks are concerned." His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over Alara, who had instinctively retreated behind Silas, her small hand clutching the rough fabric of his trousers. The woman, her lips a thin, disapproving line, added, "It ain't right, Silas. A child like that, in a house with no proper woman to guide her. And her condition. It's unnatural. Not to mention her folks might want her back. They're respectable people despite her troubles." The mention of her parents, their faces a blur of distant pain, sent a fresh wave of fear through Alara. They were a threat, a phantom limb of her past now reaching out to reclaim her. Silas, his posture unwavering, remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady, unflinching. He was a rock against the rising tide of their condemnation. "She is with me," he stated, his voice low, a rumbling current beneath the surface. "And she is safe." The simplicity of his words was like a shield, deflecting their accusations, yet it also carried a warning, an unyielding resolve. The elder scoffed. "Safe? What kind of life is that for a child, isolated, uncared for, proper-like? We've got institutions for children like her, Silas. Places where they can be managed." The word managed hung in the air, cold and clinical, evoking images of cold walls and indifferent hands, a fate far worse than any solitude. Alara, clutching Silas's leg tighter, felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. She didn't understand all their words, but she understood the intent. They wanted to take her away, to extinguish the fragile flame of peace she had found. This was the moment of truth, the breaking point. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the weight of a society's prejudices clashing against the quiet conviction of one man. Silas's grip on the wooden doorframe tightened, his knuckles white, a silent testament to the storm brewing within him. He was a man who had known subjugation, who understood the insidious power of societal control, and he would not yield. The elder, emboldened by the perceived righteousness of his cause, pressed on, his voice a drone of self-serving conviction. "We're just thinking of her welfare, Silas. A young colored girl with her disposition. It ain't fitting for her to be out here away from civilization, with no schooling, no proper guidance. The word civilization dripped with irony, given the callousness with which they approached a vulnerable child. The relative, emboldened by the elder's words, stepped forward, her face a mask of false concern. Her parents, they're decent folk. They made a hard choice, a godly choice for the good of all. They might want her back now that things have settled. The implication was clear. Ilara was a possession, to be reclaimed or discarded at will. Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. His eyes, usually so calm, now held a dangerous glint, like a deep river beginning to churn. He stepped fully into the doorway, his tall frame blocking the narrow entrance, a silent fortress against their intrusion. Her parents made their choice, Silas stated, his voice low, each word a hammer blow against their flimsy arguments. They sold her. They abandoned her. There will be no taking her back. The stark, brutal truth of his words hung in the air, momentarily silencing them. The elder's face flushed with anger. You bought a child, Silas? Like she was livestock? That ain't right, man, even for a freedman. The accusation was laced with contempt, an attempt to undermine his moral standing. Silas, however, met his gaze without flinching. I gave them coin for a life they were casting aside, he retorted, his voice rising a controlled storm. I took a child who was unwanted, deemed a burden. I took her in when no one else would. You speak of proper care, yet you would send her to a place where her spirit would be broken, where her light would be extinguished. His gaze swept over the three figures, challenging their piety, their hypocrisy. I am her guardian now. She has found peace here, a peace she never knew, and I will not allow you or anyone to disturb it. His words were a gauntlet thrown, a declaration of war. Ilara, watching him, felt a profound shift within her. She saw not just a protector, but a man who understood the profound injustice of her very existence, a man who dared to stand against the crushing weight of societal expectation. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with defiance and simmering resentment. The elder's hand instinctively went to his side, where a pistol might have rested in another time. This was not merely a dispute over a child. It was a clash of wills, a battle for the soul of a small, forgotten corner of the world, where the very definition of freedom was still being fiercely contested. The silence that followed Silas's defiant declaration was not empty, but heavy with the weight of unspoken threats and the reverberation of his resolve. The elder's hand dropped from his side, a clear sign of retreat, if only for now. This isn't over, Silas, he muttered, his voice hoarse with suppressed rage, his eyes still holding a promise of future retribution. The woman, the distant relative, whimpered, You'll regret this, Silas, bringing this trouble down on yourself. But their words, once so potent, now seemed to lack their former sting. Silas remained unyielding, a silent sentinel in the doorway. He merely watched them, his gaze unwavering, until they turned and walked away, their steps heavy with defeat. As their figures receded into the lengthening shadows, the tension slowly began to drain from Ilara's small body. She released her death grip on Silas's trousers, her fingers numb, but a strange warmth began to spread through her chest. In that moment, watching him stand firm, she understood. He had not merely purchased her, he had claimed her, not as property, but as a being worthy of protection, of a defiant kind of love. It was a love that didn't demand change, but embraced difference, a love that saw not a burden, but a fragile, unique spirit. He had risked his fragile standing in the community, perhaps even his own safety for her. The depth of his commitment resonated through her, a profound revelation that shattered the last vestiges of her pervasive fear. She looked up at him, her eyes, usually avoiding direct contact, now locked onto his, and for the first time a genuine, unburdened smile, small and tentative, touched her lips. It was a profound shift, a quiet breaking of the dam of her emotional isolation. Silas, his own face still etched with the aftermath of the confrontation, saw that smile, a fragile bloom in the desolate landscape of their shared history. He offered a slight nod, a subtle acknowledgement of their unspoken understanding, a silent promise of enduring protection. The world outside the cabin might still be cruel, might still whisper its judgments, but within these four walls, a sanctuary had been forged, not of brick and mortar but of unwavering acceptance. The hope that had been a distant, shimmering mirage now felt tangible, real. It was not a grand, sweeping rescue, but a quiet, tenacious stand against the tide of injustice, a testament to the power of one man's will to shield a vulnerable child from a world that had sought to break her. This was the true climax, not of violence, but of an emotional revelation, a moment where the bonds of chosen family were forged in the crucible of defiance. The days that followed were steeped in a quiet, enduring peace. The world outside the cabin, with its whispers and judgments, felt distant, almost irrelevant. Ilara, no longer consumed by fear, began to truly inhabit her small, safe haven. She explored the surrounding woods, her mind a sponge for the textures of bark, the subtle variations in the greens of leaves, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. Silas continued his quiet work, his presence a constant, reassuring anchor. He had a way of communicating without words, of understanding her needs before she could even formulate them. He would leave out a bowl of cool water when the heat overwhelmed her, or a soft, woven blanket when the evening chill set in. He taught her the names of the constellations, pointing to them with a gnarled finger, his voice a low, comforting hum. She, in turn, learned his rhythms, the subtle shift in his weight when he was about to rise, the soft click of his pipe being lit, the scent of fresh earth clinging to him after a day in the garden. Her sensory world, once a source of overwhelming chaos, began to settle, transformed into a landscape of quiet wonders. The sounds of the forest, once a cacophony, now resolved into distinct melodies. The chirping of crickets, the call of a distant bird, the gentle rustle of leaves. The textures, once jarring, now offered new sensations. The smoothness of a polished stone, the roughness of pine cones, the surprising softness of a spider's web. Her capacity for joy, long dormant, began to unfurl like a delicate blossom. She would laugh, a soft, breathy sound, at the antics of a squirrel, or gaze with rapt fascination at the intricate patterns of sunlight filtering through the trees. Silas, observing her transformation, felt a profound sense of purpose. He had not merely saved a life, he had nurtured a soul. The scars of his own past of slavery and struggle were still there, but now they were overlaid with a new layer of hope, a profound connection that transcended the brutality of the world. Ilara, the child deemed unmanageable and unworthy, had found a home not just in a place, but in the heart of a man who saw her not as a deficit, but as an extraordinary, precious being. The shadow of her parents and the society they represented slowly faded, replaced by the enduring light of unconditional acceptance. Their lives, once defined by the deep wounds of injustice and abandonment, were now a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to diminish them. It was not a perfect world they inhabited, but it was their world, built on a foundation of quiet understanding and defiant, unwavering love.